She was in the library when the gunman came in and they shot her from behind through her shoulder and her hand. It's really hard to read, I'm not going to lie, because as I talked with Kacey, I can see how this trauma affected her and changed her entire life. She wrestled with post-traumatic stress disorder for a long time and fear. The fear was crippling. Welcome to Book Therapy. I'm your host, Kim Patton. There's no way to count how many books are floating around in this world. Some are decent, some are truly terrible, and some are great. Today we're going to take a deep dive into one great book. Together we will discover gems of truth and encouragement to help you face your current season of life. I'm ready, you're ready, let's get this party started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Book Therapy. I meant to have a guest for you today, but unfortunately the recording did not go through. So you get stuck with me, but I am determined to tell this person's story. This is actually my third time recording. The second time I recorded an episode about this book, it disappeared. It might be on the computer somewhere. I've tried many times to get it back, but that just tells me that somebody needs to hear it. I hope you enjoy the show. Let's dive into the book. Today we are talking about Over My Shoulder, a Columbine survivor's story of resilience, hope, and a life reclaimed by Kacey Ruegsegger Johnson. Kacey is an author, speaker, and Columbine survivor. When not speaking publicly about her journey of healing and the importance of tissue donation, Kacey can be found cherishing busy days with her husband Patrick and their 4 children in the beautiful state of North Carolina. I talked to Kacey a few months ago. We had an interview online and we talked about her book, but the recording did not take. I have my side of the conversation, but I don't have her side of the conversation. So unfortunately, even though I did talk with her, I can't share that with you because I do not have it, and I'm so sorry. I hope that never happens again, but in the life of podcasting, sometimes that happens. I am going to recap kind of what we talked about based on the outline that I had created, and I'm going to share in the show notes a link to her speaking so that you can see her full story as she tells it. Kacey had a perfect childhood. She had wonderful siblings and parents that raised her in a safe and loving home. And she got into trouble as a teenager when her friend group was very close and one of them committed suicide, and that kind of sent her into a tailspin. A little bit later, another close friend committed suicide. Those 2 boys were best friends. After her wonderful childhood, she was a shy, quiet, kept to herself little girl who loved to ride horses and competing in competitions. But this tragedy, losing her friends, made her contemplate suicide herself. Her parents didn't know what to do. Their whole world was turned upside down, and her siblings didn't know how to react to Kacey's behavior because it was just so unlike her. And Kacey was just completely shut down and determined that this world didn't need her. She says on page 29, "On Wednesday morning, my folks drove me to the family doctor, another professional to whom I refused to speak. In an effort to shake my silent resolve, he asserted his authority. Kacey, I can place you in a 3-day psych hold at the hospital if you'd like, or you can cooperate with your parents." As angry as I was at the world, and all the while using my parents as a punching bag, I strangely did not want to be removed from their safety net. Their security was familiar, unlike anything a hospital would offer me, and I nodded to the doctor that I would cooperate. She spent 3 weeks at home. She basically slept on the floor of her parents' room. Her mom describes the final weeks. "I felt as if I was standing at the top of a big black vortex and hanging on to Kacey with my fingertips. I felt a heavy blanket of darkness over our home, a massive departure from all that once was." A couple months later, Kacey's heart was breaking and she came back to herself. She says, "As swiftly as the ominous clouds had blown into my life, they blew out." Her parents listened to her, but didn't ask anything of her. God wrapped his arms around that family and really took this family through the ringer before the tragedy of Columbine even happened. The weekend before Columbine, she was in a horse competition, and she won an all-around championship. But then Tuesday, April 20, 1999 happened. And if you were alive then, I was in middle school. And hearing of Columbine shocked me, of course, me and the rest of the world. But I learned about one of the young ladies who died, Rachel Joy Scott. And when Kacey and I talked, she knew her brother. Her brother actually carried her out of the library after she had been shot. The details of Columbine are in the book. She tells in excruciating detail what happened when she was in the library. She was in the library when the gunman came in and they shot her from behind through her shoulder and her hand. It's really hard to read, I'm not going to lie, because as I talked with Kacey, I can see how this trauma affected her and changed her entire life. She wrestled with post-traumatic stress disorder for a long time. And fear, the fear was crippling. She said it took like 13 to 15 years to really not see herself as a victim anymore. So the first thing I talked about with Kacey was that teenage rebellion and the tragedy of her friends and how her family really saw that dark year as harder than what happened with Columbine and after Columbine. Kacey meets a doctor who specializes in limb preservation. And after examining her and the team doing a preliminary surgery, Dr. Wilkins gave her 4 options. Number 1, amputation. Number 2, leaving the arm attached with no shoulder function. Number 3, titanium replacement with artificial joint and bone. Or number 4, bone joint transplant. Kacey was able to receive tissue donation from a cadaver. And she talks about the life that was lost in order for her to have both of her arms and both of her hands. It's not lost on her that one family is grieving while her family is rejoicing that she's able to have full function in her arms. Dr. Wilkins becomes a huge part of their family. He fights for her for years. And that leads me to my second point, which is her young adult career fluctuations. In the years following the tragedy, she is working on regaining strength in her arm after it has been shattered by the bullet. And when she enters nursing, she falls in love with the job, she loves helping people, and she's really good at it. But her arm is increasingly sore, and when she goes to see Dr. Wilkins, he unfortunately advises her to step away from her career. This was another point where Kacey had to decide if she was going to dwell on all the gunman had stole from her or redeem what she had and use it for good. This is a really hard thing for her, and I felt it when I talked to her. I don't think she particularly enjoyed talking about her story. I know that sounds strange. She's a speaker, and so she now speaks to crowds all of the time about tissue donation and her story. But I just get this feeling that it still hurts. It's still painful. And it's still not something she would have chosen for herself. I think we can all do that with what we have. We can calculate the reasons as to why we're a victim. And that's justified. But Kacey didn't want to live in that place anymore. She felt like the gunmen were taking more from her life than she could afford to lose. And so she did start to face her fears, and she did try to move on. She met a man, Patrick, and they got married. And girl actually got pregnant right away, which I was so happy to read because she'd been through so much. And the beauty of motherhood was really exactly what she needed to embrace her life fully. But her second daughter being born just 17 months later did throw her for a loop because Logan was born with a disability. She was screaming quite a bit her first few months of life, and it took them a while to realize that she had a diagnosis in her eyes that made it difficult to deal with light. I love her perspective on page 179. Only God could have known that the injuries I sustained at Columbine would turn into a huge blessing with regard to my parenting journey. I don't think anybody could have scripted that story back in the smoky haze of 1999. Knowing my Logan will have to adapt to different ways of functioning makes me thankful that I was chosen to be her mom. I get to be a living, daily witness of how wonderful life can be with a disability, that it only holds me back as far as I will let it. I can understand my daughter's physical struggles in ways few others can, and that gives beautiful purpose to our mother-daughter relationship. It is a sacred calling in my life that I don't take lightly. Kacey and her husband welcomed another girl and then another boy to complete their family of 6. Lastly, Kacey's next season of life is raising all those babies and becoming an advocate for tissue donation. Dr. Wilkins convinces her to get on the stage with him and answer questions about tissue donation, and Kacey was terrified at first, but obviously now she's been doing it so long that she's a pro. Towards the end of the book, she shares about how passionate she's been to share the message of tissue donation with the world, and how people can learn from her personal story that while the tissue donation didn't necessarily save her life, her and her doctor would say that it saved her quality of life. Kacey thinks about this a lot as far as the victim mentality and not dwelling on what the gunmen have stolen from her, but instead being grateful for the blessings of her children, of her life, and her quality of life. One thing that I found interesting, she says near the end of the book, is that law enforcement still feel awful about what happened that day in Columbine. She says, I've heard stories from officers who speak of the battle they had in their own minds during those dark, slow motion minutes. Do I lose my job and just go inside the building? At the same time, I think most of our parents would have run in without a gun or bulletproof vest just to try to help us. I've been privileged to meet some first responders who were there that day. Almost always when they find out I was injured, they are nearly in tears as they declare, please know we wanted to help you. A few of them have even apologized, but there should be no shame. I never want my response to cause more grief for these selfless people. They did what they were trained to do. It just took some healing and a more grown-up perspective for me to understand that. There are a number of people who left the field of law enforcement after that day. The scene they witnessed was just too much to overcome. I don't know the full story behind that, but it sounds like because nobody knew the protocol and it just was a brand new situation and there were orders to stay out of the building instead of going in. I'm sure there's more to that story, but Kacey has learned to offer grace to those law enforcement officers because they were doing their jobs. Kacey's life is just one of those incredible testimonies, and it's one of the best memoirs I've ever read because I remember that day, and I've read Rachel's Tears, which is a book about Rachel Joy Scott, who passed away that day, and that had a really big impact on my teenage journey, my faith journey, my perspective, and my spirituality was formed through learning about Rachel Joy Scott. And knowing that this story is still hard for Kacey to tell makes it that much more powerful and shows how brave she is. Thank you for listening to another episode of Book Therapy. Today we talked about Over My Shoulder, a Columbine survivor's story of resilience, hope, and a life reclaimed by Kacey Johnson. In the show notes, I will have a link to a full-length speech of her telling her story. I highly encourage you to read this book. It is gripping, and it will give you such a beautiful perspective on the life that God has given you. I will also link to Craig Scott, who is Rachel Joy Scott's brother, and also a podcast by my friend Melanie Brown, who got to interview Kacey Johnson, and it actually recorded. I'm so jealous. Melanie is the one who told me about Kacey and put me in touch with her, and I'm so grateful because it was really great to meet Kacey, even though you all didn't get to meet her. Listen to Mel's podcast and you'll get to meet her there. Okay, thanks for listening. See you next time.